So the time has come where I can talk about all my different experiences in the review build, the endgame beta, and all that stuff, talking about a tier list. Now, previously I did a leveling / progression tier list, and now I want to talk about sort of the leveling process, particularly the 1 to 70 process. Once you get to world tier 4, you start to unlock the build options for these really amazing scaling classes. So we're going to break this tier list up into 3 parts. We're going to have the 1 to 70 or roughly early leveling process. We're going to have the endgame pushing in a solo kind of area, and endgame pushing for a group play. Endgame is Nightmare Dungeons. Nothing else is endgame. World bosses are not endgame. Helltide zones are not endgame. The only other endgame potential content is PvP, and obviously that's super unbalanced. So, well, you just have to go with the flow for PvP. But if for PvE, at least, Nightmare Dungeons are going to be the goal. So when we consider late game XP grind or late game pushing, we consider Nightmare Dungeons and scaling up those tiers. With that said, let's start off with the leveling process. And honestly, from what I've seen, the list hasn't really changed from my initial tier list. Rogue, still S tier. Sorcerer, however, going to be dropped to A tier from S tier. There is a noticeable difference between the Sorcerer and Rogue. The Sorcerer has a lot of damage, lots of AoE, which is very good, but the Rogue is just such good single target damage and such good mobility. And before you get your mount, you're going to struggle getting through things as the Sorcerer or as any other class, in fact. Necromancer, very good damage. The problem with the Necromancer is that if they had some sort of way to boost their movement speed or to teleport or to dash, they'd be on the same tier as Sorcerer. Why? Because they do almost as much damage, if not more in some cases, than the Sorcerer. But the problem is that they don't move. They just are slow and snaily, and they just can't move anywhere. Next class, we're going to go with Barb. Barb is going to be a C tier. I don't think any class is D tier, by the way, because I don't think any class struggles that hard. But Barb and Druid both struggle quite hard. There's a discussion between which one's worse, Barb or Druid. I personally find that Druid is worse, at least from what I've seen from people experimenting with both Druid and Barb during the leveling process. The problem with Druid is that you really have to kind of play around these timing aspects, which slow you down a ton. Whereas the Barbarian, although you do a lot less damage than the previous aforementioned classes, and you have to dive in to generate resources, you can actually alleviate that to some degree with some of the Codex of Power legendaries, whereas the Druid kind of feels like you need those ones outside the Codex to even be remotely powerful in terms of just start to scaling up and up and up and up. However, as we get to the end game, it's going to change drastically. So starting off with the end game solo play here, we got to start off with the best class in the game, Barb S tier. And in fact, I think they are the only S tier class. Druid is very good, and people are commonly saying they're both S tier. I think that there's a noticeable difference between Barb and Druid. The thing with Barb is that they have one really strong build right now. Upheaval Barb is pretty okay. Ren Barb is pretty okay. Hammer the Ancients is okay, right? They're solid builds. They do a lot of damage. But then there's some really gross whirlwind aspects and uniques that just break the game. And with those aspects and uniques, which is why we have to get to World Tier 4 to start to get to those pieces, we're just going to be absolutely destroying everything once we get them. And you can even see Rob is a perfect showcase. I actually saw some of these videos, and it is just absolutely disgusting what you're able to come up with. The problem is that they have just such insane options with the aspects, and that's what's breaking the Barb right now. And guess what? That's exactly what we thought was going to happen with the fact that they have 4 aspects on their weapons, 2 two-handers and 2 one-handers. It is just destroying the game. Druid, very good, very tanky, and that is something that's really important in the end game. When you're pushing Nightmare Dungeons, that tier 100 is level 155. Going in there as a level 60 or 70 rogue, you just get one shot. And in fact, even if you're level 100 and you have a lot of damage reduction built into your kit, you're still almost getting one shot. And in fact, you still can get one shot. So survivability is more important than anything, generally speaking, when it comes to pushing. Because yeah, if you're hardcore, well, that's all that matters, right? But even if you're softcore, Nightmare Dungeons have a revive counter, which means that you can only die so many times before you fail the dungeon, which means that survivability is going to be even more important. Not only that, but the druid has some really, really nice overpower scaling mechanics, and just in general ramps up its AoE damage and even single turret damage far more as you get later on in the game. Next one's going to be Rogue. I think Rogue definitely earns a B tier here. Once again, as I've said in previous videos, Rogue is your damage dealer. They do damage. The problem with that is that that's kind of the core and only thing they're offering. Even like in solo play, which we're not even considering group buffs, right? But they don't really have a nice way to just stack damage reduction on damage reduction on damage reduction besides the general use legendary items, like the basic attacks generate damage reduction and attacks give you armor. Those are very good and they're very core aspects for the Rogue. But the problem is their damage is good, but their survivability is not as good. And that's the key, right? And in fact, even when it comes to damage, the Barb outclasses the Rogue because of the scaling whirlwind mechanics. So Rogue actually kind of has an identity crisis when Barb is considered, because it's like, yeah, they do good damage, but Barb does more and they're more survivable. So it's like, why wouldn't you go Barb in Endgame? Again, we're talking about Endgame Nightmare Dungeon pushing. If we're talking about farming Nightmare Dungeons, Rogue is still competitive and still very good and arguably better than the Druid in some scenarios. But when it comes to pushing, yeah, solo, Rogue's going to be worse. Sorcerer, I'm actually going to put them in the B tier as well, along with the Rogue. And the reason for this is they do good damage. They're safe. They're really, really solid just to outrange your opponents and just to chill in the back line. And I think B tier is good, but they're, I think, worse than the Rogue. The Rogue is going to have a couple of options. You can spec into a ranged version, as I said, to be similar to the Sorcerer, but if you go with a high risk, high reward melee payoff, you can actually outpace the Sorcerer by a good margin. Then Necromancer, and I think this one's a little bit odd. I considered putting it in C tier, but I actually think they do enough damage to where they're kind of in a B tier, C tier kind of mix here. I would say C tier, because the thing with Necromancer is that the minion build just dies. It just dies when it comes to endgame. You can't minion build at all. Like, it's just not possible. Even earlier than that, it just dies. So the only option you have is to play some sort of like caster sorcerer type build, but you're a necromancer, which means you're just worse at it than the sorcerer. So I would say if sorcerer's in B tier, I'd probably put necromancer in C tier. You don't have as much survivability options as the sorcerer. You don't have as much damage amping options as the sorcerer, even though the necromancer has a really nice use of vulnerability with their bone spear. If you do run bone spear build, you can have permanent vulnerability, which is very, very strong. But between like trapping builds on the Rogue, you're going to get a lot more damage and being able to run around. Sorcerer, you're going to have that ranged cannon effect. And then, you know, you got Necro, who can't move, can't run away from enemies, which is a possibility that you have to do. And they don't do as effective as a Sorcerer when they're kind of playing the same class. So as for solo pushings, this is what my tier list would be. Let's talk about group play, because it's something that not a lot of people are talking about. So guess what, guys? Barb S tier again. I think that in the times where you're having the Barb in the game and you're whirlwinding, you run oftentimes multiple shouts in that build, and you can offer so much support for your squad. Even if you don't want to run, let's say, a whirlwind Barb and just one-shot everything while also supporting your team, you could also just support your team with massive abilities to do so, and you're going to do some really, really amazing things with the Barb in group play. I think that, honestly, no one is disputing the fact that Barbarian is absolutely disgusting in the end game, and well, this tier list is not going to disagree with that either, because I've seen it and it is gross. Okay, next one, and this one might be a little bit interesting. Druid. Maybe this isn't actually a controversial take, but I think Druid's just going to be S tier as well. Ooh. Are they a step down from Barbarian in group play? I think still they're a step down. I think Barbarian is just that good. I think Barbarian is just that good. I think Druid, once again, they have a lot of potential to give you damage reduction for your team, a lot of ways to support your team in terms of just AoE CCing, just ways to amp up and really crush through, and do offer a lot of damage. And that's a key component as well. When we're considering group play, you need damage. You need, or you hope that people can support you while also doing damage, or just straight up supporting you. And Barbarian and Druid both do that, where they actually offer some of the highest DPS while also supporting your team, which is just absolutely absurd to me. So Druid is going to be A tier. Necro, this is a hot take, guys. A tier. Necro, I don't know why people consider Necro not as good as like Druid. The Necro has such powerful supporting abilities for group play, and actually playing with Echo Hack has really kind of opened my eyes to the Necromancer in group play. Guys, yes, Barb is one-shotting things. Druid doesn't really do that. Doesn't do things like the Barb does, okay? That's why they're A tier. And Necro, they have the Pixel Pull, where they can group everyone together and have people absolutely annihilate, which is really good for the Barb as well. They have things like Bone Prison, which can really help out a lot. They have things like Decrepify. They have things that can curse enemies, right, and offer extra damage to your team. This is a really powerful supporting class while also offering potentially permanent vulnerability across everyone with Bone Spear. I mean, this is a really powerful group play class, and in fact, despite not being able to use summons, which you should just never use summons, guys, they're just trash, outside of like the first 50 levels, even then it's a little bit, Necromancer has a problem where it does not support summon builds very well. Just in the game itself, it's not that the summons are bad, it's just that they scale so poorly. So like at the beginning of the game, they can offer you some things, but later on you just have to play a support build or just a Bone Spear damage build for yourself. You can run some Blood Orb builds, which are really powerful as well, but overall I think Necromancer actually ends up in the A tier. Ooh. And for the last two, I think Rogue is honestly the worst in group play. Here's the problem with the Rogue in group play. You have the Barbarian. Why would you need a Rogue? The problem with group play when you get to the end game pushing is like, Barb's gonna one-shot everything anyways. Why do you need a Rogue to kill things when Barb is one-shotting and providing support, and the Druid is providing support and doing good damage as well? I'd rather just have like, honestly, you could even put Rogue in the C tier for group play pushing. And again, it comes down to identity crisis. Like when you talk about A and S tier classes, and we'll talk about the sorcerer in just a second, you have like very good CC, very good setup from the Druid and Necromancer, right? Which buff the Barb a lot. The Barb has really good DPS, the strongest endgame pushing DPS, which can carry you in XP farming as well as offering the shout bonuses to your team. Then you have the Sorcerer, which does offer some CC potential, some vulnerability potential, and just overall just solid options for a very base support. Not that you're going to be like setting up players, but you're going to be able to contribute in terms of CC and options like that. The Rogue, I have a trouble. It maybe it's C tier, maybe it's B tier here. Whoops. But I think that it kind of fits around this category. The only other option I see is running like a full trap support build Rogue slash DPS, and that can actually work. And I think that's probably worthy of a B tier here, because what you can do is you can like trap people, cause them to be dazed, and then CC them that way. So you could actually do some really solid things there. And I think that's going to be kind of your options for the Rogue. But what I've seen is, again, why would you care about CCing people slightly and doing good damage when the Barbarian supports your team and just one-shots things, and then you have better CC options above you? You know what I mean? The Rogue just has an identity crisis here, and I think that in general the Rogue has an identity crisis outside of the early game, which is going to absolutely blast. The Rogue's advantage is that the 1 to 100 process is going to be, well, I should say 1 to 70 process is going to be far easier and absolutely disgusting. But then when people start to catch up to you, you're going to realize that you don't really have an advantage anymore. You're kind of just on par with people. And then when you reach the endgame pushing, you're going to realize, wait a second, it is a lot tougher for me to get into things and actually compete with the Barb and Druid. Does that mean that the Rogue cannot push? No, that's not what that means. Doesn't mean that the Rogue can't compete and it can't do some of the end game content. What I'm saying is it just does it worse than the other classes in group play specifically, and in solo play, you're going to have the Barb and Druid kind of above it, especially if you don't get some really nice options as the Rogue, and you're not really paying attention, because it is hard to survive in some cases if you don't know how your Dark Shroud works and you don't keep up your armor slash damage reduction constantly. So that's going to be the tier list, guys. There's the group play, there's the leveling process, and there is the overall just final rankings for the launch of the game. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I really think that the Druid is particularly overtuned when it comes to Whirlwind. It seems a little bit odd that there isn't really any other options for any other class at the current moment to do what the Barbarian does, like not even close. And if Blizzard maintains what they earlier mentioned, which is that we don't want one build to be like the build, then they're going to be nerfing Whirlwind come season 1. So we'll see about that. And this tier list will obviously change every season that comes. So thanks for watching, everyone. And I'll see you all for the next one.